So the first thing that I did when I joined the firm was to develop an investment strategy that put crypto in a broader landscape. So hopefully this sort of framing is helpful to some of you here to think about how we can get really in the weeds of the very specific technologies that we're using and SDKs and APIs and how these things all fit together. But I like to try and put it all into a broader context that but also most of my time is spent with policymakers and regulators so that they can understand how this fits into the broader landscape. So we call this the convergent stack, and it really consists of three very simple layers, which is data production, data distribution, and data consumption. So like any other value chain, production, distribution, and consumption, and we see data as a new emerging value chain. And I can talk through each of those. That's all right. There's only like 4 slides. It's fine. So as I said, we see this as 3 different layers, and the bottom layer here is what we call the production layer. I guess you could just simplify and call this the Internet of Things, or sensor networks, or machines that are sort of collecting the data. I prefer to use the word production because it's sort of more all-encapsulating than just the Internet of Things. But what we're really talking about here is data collection, data aggregation, and data indexing. And actually, when we speak with, I suppose, not the startup ecosystem, but more the corporate ecosystem or the government ecosystem, most of their problems aren't, or in fact, none of their problems are blockchain-related problems. And in most cases, they're not actually AI-related problems. They don't sort of associate that. What they actually understand is we have data, or we have data in our CRM system, or we have data in our ERP system, or we have data that we're now collecting from some factory machine. And we're collecting it in some way, but it's really just going to some database, or it's going to some silo somewhere that we have no idea how to generate value from it. So there's this challenge, and a lot of web startups and a lot of, I guess, digital startups rather than large incumbents are at this point of aggregation. Sure, we can have a data lake, we can find ways to collect them, open APIs are making this a lot easier. But this aggregation of data sets, and interestingly enough, I spoke with Shell last week, and Shell collect terabytes of data a day from different well sites and things. And obviously it's all in, from a logistical perspective, it's just much easier to keep it locally on site. But their challenge is not necessarily that they can't get it in a data lake, it's just that this indexing component. The data isn't indexed in any real meaningful way that can be correlated. So they have vast amounts of data that is aggregated, but they have no idea of where it came from, the provenance of the data originally. So in most cases, it just sits there latent, or they have to delete it because there's no use for it. They don't know where it came from. They can't pass the data and mung it or clean it in any way that becomes useful. And of course, some companies are further ahead than others. But really, this production problem isn't a blockchain problem. This is just a data problem, data hygiene. And we think that really, in order to get to the real benefits, the value benefits, there has to be a real clear focus on how data is collected, how it's aggregated, and how it's indexed. And sort of without that, you can use a distributed ledger, or you can use machine learning algorithms, but ultimately, you're not going to derive the maximum amount of value that you should be able to. And this is where, originally when we were thinking through how this thing fits together, this is what you would previously had just blockchain on, right? The blockchain will solve the distribution of data problem. And I think we all know at this point that that's not the case. It plays a role, a relatively small role in a larger tech stack. But really, what I like to think about is not the technology, but what is it enabling? and what is the actual use case or the problem to be solved, rather than the technology. And then we don't get bogged down in specific discussions about the specific technology that's used, the configuration, because that'll vary. So this distribution layer, we've collected data now, how do we move it around, essentially, or secure it? We sort of break this down very simply into authenticate, permission, and analyze. And that's work that we're UPort are doing wonderfully in, well, UPort 3-box now, but we also support Sovereign and lots of other wonderful sort of self-sovereign identity platforms, and new ways to authenticate data in a self-sovereign way. I think that's quite an important element to this tech stack that's developing. And then this permissioning part of that, right? So who has access, and under what circumstances? And I'm sure Ocean will talk in a bit more depth later on around this permissioning system, because you can argue, quite rightly, for many use cases it should be completely permissionless. Everybody should have access, everybody should be able to do what they want with the data, but there will be certain applications, use cases, industries for which the permissioning part is one of the most important elements from regulatory and compliance. So if we want to develop this tech stack, this Web3 tech stack, whatever we want to call it, permissioning or ways of permission is quite an important, at least, consideration. And then finally, there's the analyze component of it. So I guess Chainalysis are the best example of this, but they've got one customer, law enforcement. But that's a very early example of, once we get more of this data, at least hashed on blockchains and in decentralized databases and on decentralized compute platforms and the like, and in decentralized storage, there'll be new and very interesting ways to analyze that data within that system. And in an ideal scenario, a lot of that data will be in a similar format. It'll be in an easy and accessible way, and it'll be a way in which we can actually analyze the data and make correlations, but not just because we've handed over all of the data. We have no idea what correlations are being drawn over there, but instead we as individuals, after being authenticated, will understand how our data is being used and can revoke permissions if that's necessary, or we can give conditional-based permissioning. So the point of distribution isn't necessarily to think through all of the specific technologies that are needed, more of a case of saying, we can't forget that in order to unlock data for AI, which is what Ocean Protocol are here to do, we need to make sure that each layer is thought out in advance. So there's this production layer, then there's the distribution layer, and then the sort of final layer. And ultimately, I would describe all this as back office in the financial sense. All of this is databases that nobody knows that are being used. End user doesn't know if Hadoop's being used, or an end user doesn't know if OrbitDB is being used. Most of this stuff will pretty much be obfuscated and abstracted away from the end user. The person that's using 3-box, for example, or Brave, or whatever the DApp of the moment is, won't really understand exactly what technologies are being used or have any name recognition around that. And that's to be expected, but this stuff is foundational. And I think that this is the core problem. So this is really one of the challenges, I guess, of being around in the industry for a while now is we've gone through a couple of different cycles of excitement, and then of disappointment, and then excitement and disappointment. So ignoring sort of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies for a moment, really there was excitement that there's this new, I guess, way of distributing and having decentralized agreement on transaction validation. And lots of corporates got excited, and lots of businesses got excited, and governments got excited, and ran, say, a proof of concept or ran a trial, and didn't really get the return on investment or understanding that they wanted from the project. And many of these proof of concepts are laying dormant in lots of businesses around the globe. It's because they've framed the problem in the wrong way. they've got a blockchain architect or they've got a blockchain strategy and they've gone out and they've picked a blockchain problem to solve. But actually the problems to solve aren't blockchain related at all. They're data problems, they're machine learning problems. They've got data sets, they want to derive value from it. And this is an automation problem. This is, how do you automate processes? This is an optimization problem. How do you, derive patterns and optimize processes? And then there's this sort of trade component, which is the new part. Again, that's Ocean, but others enable, which is, how do you trade data in a way that's meaningful? That's a component that we're missing. And you can explain to a policymaker or a regulator this idea of, well, all of this data helps automation. Smart contracts will help create efficiencies, lower the costs of legal contracts, et cetera, et cetera. That makes sense. This idea that, well, right now, there's only a very few select companies around the globe that have the required data sets to really optimize processes in a meaningful way. DeepMind or Google or we all know the enemy. But there's very few that can do that in a meaningful way. And then there's this last component, and that's the bit that's quite hard to persuade people that this is possible, which is this trading of data. I think to some extent it's binary today. We have it, or machines are throwing it off, and it goes to a database that has an administrator or an owner, and that data is owned. But that's binary. We have it, or they have it, or it's given away for free, or it's sold as a feed to Bloomberg or Thomson Reuters. But this idea that it's tradable, that's the huge leap that I think we need to make, and that's the story that resonates, but yet people can't get their head around. So, right, in order to trade something, in order to trade data, it needs a format. So the sort of, what is the MP3 for data, or the JSON for data? I mean, JSON possibly is for data, but more of a generic file format that makes it easy to be able to buy, sell, trade that data. Ocean created a marketplace for it, but you need to be able to package it up and sell it, or trade it, or lease it in a way that's meaningful. And I think when you explain that, you sort of tap into a macro narrative that's going on globally, sort of the fight between privacy and surveillance, or this sort of debate around personal privacy and surveillance capitalism. It's all part of how to manage data in, to use the buzzword, the fourth industrial revolution, or whatever we're going through now. The big question, for which privacy is a part of, is how do we best manage data? Because managing data there isn't just one answer. It's not let's make everything private because that's better for the individual. For a lot of individuals, it is. But also there are huge benefits to be had from the pooling of data, to be able to run machine learning algorithms on to generate real insights and to be able to unlock value that wouldn't be able to unlock with less data. So just a really good example, right? DeepMind got fined by the UK Ombudsman for their data collection practices. And it's quite worrying to think that a company like DeepMind has access to everybody's health records, because who knows what they'll be able to find out and what will happen with that data. And that's true. And personally, I feel very uncomfortable and wouldn't want to do that. And the same with 21andMe having all of our genetic data. But we have to, I guess, at least understand that there could be some huge societal benefits to understand certain trends in data around cancers or around different diseases that wouldn't be able to be found if we all had private data. So it's not to advocate on behalf of giving it all away for free, but the narrative is to say, well, look, there are benefits to be had, but we need to have a conversation and to create technologies that enable that sort of granular permissioning, or to give the user choice in what they share and what they don't share. And I think what Ocean are doing, and certainly what Sovereign, one of our other portfolio companies, and all of the other projects that we support, what they're really doing is just building technology that means you don't have to give all your data away for free, right? Some people might choose to, and some people might choose to retain it, but we're building technologies that aren't just binary. And so there can be some granularity around it. And that's what we sort of think about when we think of the convergent stack, which is this sort of production of data, the distribution of it, and then the consumption of it. That's the meat of it. And to turn that into a set of technologies, this is how we have refined those 9 boxes into very discrete technology areas that we want to advise, support, and invest in. So again, production, distribution, consumption, you can see that the layers, and we've just sort of expanded out the distribution layer and the consumption layer into 3 and into 2. But what we're just framing here is, in order to create a open, shared, and in some cases tokenized data economy, there are a set of technologies that need to be built, mature, and need to work and interoperate. And that comes from this sort of hardware layer at the bottom through to decentralized storage, decentralized databases, bridges, interoperability, compute. You can all read, but it sort of works its way up to the applications on top, the marketplaces for data that Ocean are enabling, and sort of machine learning, distributed machine learning algorithms at the top. And that's really the way we see the world, our investment strategy, and the way that we support the ecosystem and community is in building this. So we take a very different approach. We don't just say we are a seed stage investor and we will only invest in seed stage businesses that are building exchanges. We take a very different view. This is the vision of the world that we want to see built. And whether it's a pre-seed company, whether it's a seed company, whether it's a later stage, they have a token, they don't have a token, or even in some senses, they're a large corporate like Intel or ARM, will try and work with anybody that is committed to building an open, shared, tokenized data economy, including, obviously, Ocean. And as part of that is this sort of just a final little plug, is that we are coming to Berlin, on the 19th and 20th of October, where we'll be doing a hackathon. Ocean are a part of that. And lots of other of the companies that were mentioned there, including Agoric and Cosmos, Aragon, lots of others that are going to be participating in this. And this is where we want to try to get hack teams to come and build connections between those things, to hack on top of Ocean, to combine Ocean with Sovereign, to combine Aragon with Foam, who knows? But the idea is we want to manifest that vision of a future because we think it's desperately needed. And that's me. I hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you, Lawrence. Would you take a question or two if we can?
Love to.
Get someone in the audience interested in a question for Lawrence?
I have a question.
Here.
With the 3 layers, is it centered more around the data owner, basically on the supply side of the data, or the demand side, or it's like a both sides? Because some things like analyze, if you have a data set, right, if I'm on the demand side, it's not applicable to me, but some portions are. So how much focus in your research to put into the origination of the data versus the needs of the consumption side?
That's a great question. And actually, that gets to the heart, I think, of which areas require a incentive or a marketplace and which don't. So in some of those senses, like the hardware, for example, that collects the data, I think that in every single one there is a data source, a supply, and then there's data demand, who's using it. I think that goes all the way up. So each one has a supply and demand, supply and demand, supply and demand, all the way up to an application where ultimately there's just a user of the data. Mm-hmm. So actually I think and this actually is, I don't know if anybody could help on this. This is something that I think about constantly and don't have a clear answer to, which is there is a supply and demand, and therefore there's a relationship between a seller and a buyer. you would instinctively think there's a need to coordinate resources, find the best price, and to create the right incentives, which suggests to me there is potential for a token in some sense, however that's designed. And I think that wherever there is a buyer and a seller of data, I think there is an opportunity for a token. Maybe not its own token, maybe it's using ETH or Ocean or Bitcoin, I don't know. But I don't know at what point that falls away. The application layer, I think probably not, because there's just a user and then they're collecting the data. But I don't know if it's every technology area for which there might be a need for a token, or it's just the application layer. Still unclear to me, and we don't have a firm view on that yet.
I spent some time thinking about this as well, and what's interesting is that it seems like when the stack is, and you look at it very structurally, when the stack gets quite high, what's interesting is that even if you have an amazingly well-designed incentive layer to, let's say, incentivize the supply of data sets at a certain part of the stack, you really cannot really expect the whole stack to work very well unless the other layers also have some equivalents or they're good enough. And it takes only one faulty level to make basically a breakage of the entire pipeline. And what I'm thinking lately is a meta layer of an incentive mechanism that can really smooth these gaps and make sure that there is effectively, imagine at the hardware level, I'm using the ledger. If I opt into something, I may get some of this incentive at the meta layer, which is contributed in part by Ocean, in part by this, right? And they're all together working towards the same goal.
Yeah, that makes sense. And right. that it's challenging, huh? Because you can end up, it's a system of a system, which is wildly complex, and this is overly simplifying it just for clarity. But what you've just described there and going deep in understanding where the breakages go, I think that that's where the rubber hits the road with this, right? You're digging into, okay, sounds great in theory, but how do they all work together? And I think my gut tells me, well, Occam's razor, let's try and simplify it and just have a single meta token, maybe that's ETH, right? Who knows? And the rest somehow interoperate with that. But then how that relates to value capture is the other big question that's outstanding, I guess.
One more question?
Yeah, just really a statement to say that we had a conversation with Trent on Wednesday about doing exactly that, using Ocean as the data marketplace for another protocol, and just working out the value exchange between the two tokens so that each subsystem manages its own value capture and you hand off between those systems.
I think I'd love to see more work in that, and I think ultimately it comes to a file form. I don't know if it's just me being overly simplifying the matter, but I just think that if there's you can end up getting overly complicated. A single thing like Ocean that has a price discovery mechanism and a file format could be the perfect answer to that, because then the challenge is the price discovery mechanism bit. I think that's the hard thing. How do you have an exchange rate mechanism between the two? Yeah. And you don't want that to be overly complicated. Maybe Dimi's work on bonding curves or whatever could be the answer. Yeah. I don't know, but I'd love to hear more about that.
We've got Zargan working on.
I'm sure. That's the thing. I'm sure Zargan will come up with some really good answers to it. Probably very complicated, but thank you.
All right, thank you. Good questions, and thank you, Lawrence, very much for your insights. Thanks.